The Jericho Network on Westwood One.
Just before we get started with today's show, I want to fill you in on an upcoming episode of the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. We're putting together a special Q&A episode. The episode will feature questions from you, questions that you feel have gone unanswered in previous episodes, or questions that we haven't even dealt with before on the show. Here's your opportunity to unload all of your burning questions. And if I can't answer it, we'll find the person who can. Record your questions, including your name and where you're from. Then email your audio to me at rrtz.questions@gmail.com. That's rrtz.questions@gmail.com. This special Q&A edition of the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone will drop later this summer.
On the whole, the evidence strongly says, drug addict, junkie, no way.
This is the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone with Richard Serrett. Heard exclusively on the Jericho Network in partnership with Westwood One. Unearthing the biggest stories from the history of rock. Exposing the truth and the tragedy. The stories behind rock's immortals. The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. What might happen is that we blow your mind. Here's your host, Richard Serrett.
You're listening to part 2 of our 2-part series on the death of Kurt Cobain. Listen to the lyrics of the Nirvana song, You Know You're Right. I will never bother you. I will never promise to. I will never follow you. I will never bother you. Never speak a word again. I will crawl away for good. Many Nirvana fans consider this song and these lyrics as Kurt Cobain's goodbye. The message in You Know You're Right corresponds to what he wrote in his supposed suicide note. But for others, Kurt Cobain's death on April 5th, 1994, or thereabouts, has never been an open and shut case of suicide. From the moment news broke of the discovery of his body in his Seattle area home on April 8th, from a supposed self-inflicted shotgun blast to the head, there have been nagging questions that remain unanswered to this day. How does one turn a long rifle, such as a Remington 11 20-gauge shotgun around, place the barrel in one's mouth, and be able to reach the trigger? Assuming your arms were in fact long enough, how do you carry out such a gruesome task if you have enough heroin in your system to render you unconscious within seconds of the injection? Then there's the supposed suicide note. The first part of the note, according to his own lawyer, appears more like a pastiche than a cohesive goodbye letter. A forensic linguist adds to the theory by pointing out that the top portion of the long note, as well as appearing to be in a different handwriting, is also of a different style linguistically to the bottom 4 lines. Many fans see Kurt's supposed suicide note as a goodbye to Nirvana, not to life. Then there are the final 4 lines, written in a markedly different handwriting style. Francis and Courtney, I'll be at your altar. Please keep going, Courtney, for Francis, for her life, which will be so much happier without me. Were these lines tacked on by a forger to make the letter seem more like a suicide note? A number of investigators have wondered. Then there was the discovery of a handwriting practice sheet in Courtney's backpack, which contained different letters of the alphabet, which were compared to the suicide note. The practice sheet contains letter combinations of specific letters that are found in the bottom portion of that suicide note. This, according to one handwriting analysis expert. In a taped conversation, Courtney Love's lawyer, Rosemary Carroll, states she believes Love forged the letter. We're reopening the Kurt Cobain file here on the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. Welcome to part 2 of Smells Like Murder, the death of Kurt Cobain.
Welcome back to the Rock and Roll Zone. Here's Richard Serrett.
You're listening to part 2 of our 2-part series, Smells Like Murder, The Death of Kurt Cobain. First, a recap.
Kurt disappears from an LA rehab facility. And at this point, Courtney Love enters the picture. She hires a private detective, Tom Grant, in LA, to find her husband.
They found his body in a greenhouse in his home in Seattle, Washington on April the 8th.
So nobody really knows when Cobain died, and nobody really has truthful stories about the days leading up to his death.
The forensic medical response is that he died from a gunshot wound. He actually put the gun in his mouth and died instantly.
It had, I believe, a 28-inch barrel. There's I believe it's called a flash suppressor or a choke bore at the end, which adds another 6 inches, which does bring about certainly that issue as to whether it would have been possible to turn the gun on himself.
There were no fingerprints found on the shotgun.
I discovered video in 1994 that showed the top of Cobain's head intact and no blood, not one drop of blood around the top of his head on the floor where the body was found. And that is an impossibility.
That it would have been completely impossible for somebody to have taken that level of heroin and then neatly put away the heroin kit, picked up a shotgun, stuck it in his mouth, and pulled the trigger. He would have been unconscious within seconds of taking this kind of dose.
That note that was written didn't necessarily say that it was written to Courtney and his daughter. It was mostly for Nirvana fans, telling them why he wanted to quit the music business altogether.
Rosemary Carroll said that Courtney Love left behind a backpack, which included a practice page or pages in which she was practicing someone's handwriting, which looks astonishingly similar, especially to the bottom lines in the notes.
That's Rich Lee, a Seattle-based independent investigative journalist who suspected a homicide in the Cobain case almost immediately. In fact, he started a public access cable TV show dedicated to investigating Cobain's murder. Part of the narrative which feeds into a possible suicide is Cobain's battle with depression, a fact few dispute. Eric Alper is a music correspondent and a PR consultant to multiple rock legends.
Kurt Cobain actually comes from a bipolar family. He's actually not the first Cobain to kill himself, because when Kurt was 12 years old, his great uncle Burry, who was brother to Kurt's grandfather, Leland, had shot himself in the stomach and in the head. And so that's where some of that bipolar disorder and that manic depression comes from in the Kurt Cobain family. And it's actually because we now know that disease is mostly hereditary. Most of Kurt Cobain's depression comes from realistically starting off as a child. When Kurt was just a young kid, he would actually seek sanctuary in his bedroom closet. He just didn't want to be around people and hang out. And, you know, he abused alcohol. He was really high energy. He was filled with rage. And all of that comes from the fact that this is what his family was kind of based on. There was, you know, interviews with Kurt's cousin that asked her about, other than the mental health problems, besides just general depression, what else was there? And his cousin Bev said that he was diagnosed at a young age with ADD, then later with bipolar disorder, and that the illness had the same characteristics as major clinical depression with mood swings, and that Kurt knew where his family had come from, and that he was terrified that he was actually going to be having all of these symptoms based on his DNA and his genes, the fact that there was mental illness on both sides of Kurt's family tree. On his mother's, Wendy's side of the family, there's also mental illness, because Wendy's mother, Peggy, was 10. Her father, which was, you know, Wendy's grandfather, stabbed himself in front of his family, and he was committed to a mental hospital. So he was very well aware that there were issues and that there were problems in that genetic family tree going back a couple of generations by the time that Kurt was actually born.
But not so fast. Others who've investigated Cobain's death suggest this narrative ignores some important developments in Kurt's life shortly before his death. Max Wallace is the co-author of Love and Death, The Murder of Kurt Cobain.
Within days of Kurt's death, Courtney was giving interviews to everybody who would listen and talking about how he had a family history of suicide, his great uncles had committed suicide, and so it was sort of natural. And this fed into the conventional narrative that it was sort of inevitable. Kurt was always suicidal. He had family history of suicide. There was mental illness in his family. And yet the fact is that Kurt has given an interview to Rolling Stone magazine just a couple months earlier saying he'd never been happier in his life. There was some indication earlier that he may have been suicidal. Some of his lyrics were hinted at suicide in some of his interviews, but that coincides with a period where he had this unbearable stomach pain that he couldn't diagnose. That's why he became a heroin addict. The heroin was designed to treat this severe pain that he'd suffered most of his life. But a few months before he died, he was finally diagnosed, and the pain was linked to a pinched nerve related to scoliosis. And as soon as it was diagnosed, it was treated. All of a sudden, once the pain is diagnosed by his doctors and he's getting medical treatment, he starts changing his tune. He's never been happier in his life. He's doting on his new baby daughter, and there's certainly no talk of depression or suicide.
I think Kurt Cobain was a thoroughly all right guy, you know. What does he do at the end of all of his music videos, or at least most of them? There's a big smile on his face, you know what I mean? The gloomy act was just a part of being a musician. When people think about Kurt Cobain, they should think about that. Great American band leaders, you know, Louis Armstrong, Dick Spiderbeck, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain. Band leaders are actually some of our greatest artists. Our band leaders are second to none. That is the definitive American art form, even more so than movie directors. Band leaders. And Kurt Cobain loved being a musician. Kurt Cobain loved being a band leader. And when you see that smirk on his face at the end of these gloomy, moody videos, you should understand that without even considering money or the treachery of the people around him and all of that, Kurt Cobain enjoyed being a musician. That's why he was so good at it. And he was not suicidal. There's no evidence of his being suicidal anywhere in his psychological history. Although you look at the media and he was clinically depressed. Well, what clinic ever called him clinically depressed? What person ever called him depressed during his lifetime? No one of reliable reputation.
And what of the long-held belief that Cobain was hopelessly addicted to heroin? If he didn't have a serious drug problem, why did Love and his manager and members of Nirvana, excluding David Grohl, stage a 5-hour intervention? Once again, Rich Lee.
Kurt Cobain actually comes from a bipolar family. He's actually not the first Cobain to kill himself, because when Kurt was 12 years old, his great uncle Burry, who was brother to Kurt's grandfather, Leland, had shot himself in the stomach and in the head. And so that's where some of that bipolar disorder and that manic depression comes from in the Kurt Cobain family. And it's actually because we now know that disease is mostly hereditary. Most of Kurt Cobain's depression comes from realistically starting off as a child. When Kurt was just a young kid, he would actually seek sanctuary in his bedroom closet. He just didn't want to be around people and hang out. And, you know, he abused alcohol. He was really high energy. He was filled with rage. And all of that comes from the fact that this is what his family was kind of based on. There was, you know, interviews with Kurt's cousin that asked her about, other than the mental health problems, besides just general depression, what else was there? And his cousin Bev said that he was diagnosed at a young age with ADD, then later with bipolar disorder, and that the illness had the same characteristics as major clinical depression with mood swings, and that Kurt knew where his family had come from, and that he was terrified that he was actually going to be having all of these symptoms based on his DNA and his genes, the fact that there was mental illness on both sides of Kurt's family tree. On his mother's, Wendy's side of the family, there's also mental illness, because Wendy's mother, Peggy, was 10. Her father, which was, you know, Wendy's grandfather, stabbed himself in front of his family, and he was committed to a mental hospital. So he was very well aware that there there were issues and that there were problems in that genetic family tree going back a couple of generations by the time that Kurt was actually born.
Within days of Kurt's death, Courtney was giving interviews to everybody who would listen and talking about how he had a family history of suicide, his great uncles had committed suicide, and so it was sort of natural. And this fed into the conventional narrative that it was sort of inevitable. Kurt was always suicidal, he had family history of suicide, there was mental illness in his family, and yet the fact is that Kurt has given an interview to Rolling Stone magazine just a couple months earlier saying he'd never been happier in his life. There was some indication earlier that he may have been suicidal. Some of his lyrics were hinted at suicide in some of his interviews, but that coincides with a period where he had this unbearable stomach pain that he couldn't diagnose. That's why he became a heroin addict. The heroin was designed to treat this severe pain that he'd suffered most of his life. But a few months before he died, he was finally diagnosed. The pain was linked to a pinched nerve related to scoliosis. And as soon as it was diagnosed, it was treated. All of a sudden, once the pain is diagnosed by his doctors and he's getting medical treatment, he starts changing his tune. He's never been happier in his life. He's doting on his new baby daughter. And there's certainly no talk of depression or suicide.
I think Kurt Cobain was a thoroughly all right guy, you know. What does he do at the end of all of his music videos, or at least most of them? There's a big smile on his face, you know what I mean? The gloomy act was just a part of being a musician. When people think about Kurt Cobain, they should think about that. Great American band leaders, you know, Louis Armstrong, Dick Spiderbeck, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain. Band leaders are actually some of our greatest artists. Our band leaders are second to none. That is the definitive American art form, even more so than movie directors. Band leaders. And Kurt Cobain loved being a musician. Kurt Cobain loved being a band leader. And when you see that smirk on his face at the end of these gloomy, moody videos, you should understand that without even considering money or the treachery of the people around him and all of that, Kurt Cobain enjoyed being a musician. That's why he was so good at it. And he was not suicidal. There's no evidence of his being suicidal anywhere in his psychological history. Although you look at the media and he was clinically depressed. Well, what clinic ever called him clinically depressed? What person ever called him depressed during his lifetime? No one of reliable reputation. Well, he did a lot of work, and he never gave a bad concert that I know of, and there were voice problems at the very end, which is why the European tour was canceled. If he used opiates at all, like millions of Americans who are using them and not dying and not committing suicide, if he did use opiates for his stomach on an ongoing basis, then he had that under control. The most legitimate interview he ever gave in terms of talking to the standard press would have been with Robert Hilburn of the Los Angeles Times, and he told Hilburn that he dabbled in heroin, and this was because of excruciating stomach pain and inability to find a doctor who would prescribe him the right thing to alleviate this pain. That's all what I've seen him say on video as well. Now, there were other statements. There was a cover of a magazine in Britain, during Kurt's life where the headline was something like, "We just fill up turkey basters full of the stuff and shoot, massive amounts of the junk right into our veins." Cobain knew that the English press particularly is very keen on documenting drug abuse by all rockers, whether it, is real or not. He told Hilburn of the Los Angeles Times, "I dabbled, it's over. Using drugs, hard drugs, is a waste of time. I won't be doing it again." Those are the words of Kurt Cobain. The stuff about the turkey basters and all of that, well, that's Kurt's humor. And certainly in recent years, there has been a difficulty among journalists and pseudo-journalists like the people who made the Montage of Heck movie in dividing Cobain's dark sense of humor and, the reality of, was he a drug addict or was he not? On the whole, the evidence strongly says, drug addict, junkie, no way.
When the rock and roll Twilight Zone continues, a whistleblower, 'Whistleblower' 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 'Whistleb
Twilight Zone. Here's Richard Serrett.
On this episode of the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, we're reopening the Kurt Cobain file. Was it suicide or murder? So, let's summarize the evidence. Investigators like Max Wallace and Richard Lee say point to murder. The length of the shotgun Cobain supposedly used to kill himself would make it impossible for him to place the barrel in his mouth and then reach the trigger with his outstretched arms. The lack of blood at the scene or a serious head wound. The amount of heroin metabolized in his bloodstream was several times the lethal dose for even the most hardened drug addict, and Cobain would have been unconscious before he would have had a chance to shoot himself. Although on this point, Rich Lee disagrees. He insists that Cobain's toxicology report, including the levels of morphine in his blood, were never officially released, and that this information was reported by Kurt's widow, Courtney Love. Contrary to what Wallace and Lee describe as a carefully crafted narrative, Cobain was not a drug addict, and he was not clinically depressed or suicidal. There is evidence that sections of the supposed suicide note found at the death scene were forged. Cobain and Love's attorney, Rosemary Carroll, was recorded in conversation with Love's private investigator, Tom Grant, saying she believed the letter was forged. Carroll stated that she found handwriting practice sheets in Courtney's backpack, and it appeared she was practicing writing in Kurt's style. Which brings us to one of the more colorful characters involved in this saga. Eldon Wayne Hoke, nicknamed El Duce, was best known as the drummer and lead singer of the shock rock band The Mentors. Eric Alper.
He was one of these heavy metal punk rock staples that was based around the California area. And in addition to his musical career, he also had jobs as an extra in TV. And then after the death of Kurt, he started making the claim that Courtney Love had offered to pay him in order to kill Kurt Cobain. He promoted his story on the Jerry Springer show, I remember, and then the National Enquirer picked it up. And then in Nick Bromfield's Kurt and Courtney documentary, it's got a pretty substantial place in it. And he actually claimed in the film that he knew who killed Kurt Cobain, and he gave the name Allen. It's Allen, but he said that he wouldn't actually go track him down, that the FBI would actually end up, catching him anyway.
He told me shortly before New Year's Eve in 1993, Courtney shows up at one of his gigs and asks him to kill her old man, Kurt, and offers him $100,000 to do it. He was skeptical. He thought she was joking. He said, "Are you serious?" She allegedly said, "I'm as serious as a heart attack." So nothing happened. He didn't take it seriously. But when Kurt was found dead just a few months later, he started to wonder, maybe Courtney had something to do with it. It sort of adds up.
Eldon Hoke, known to his friends and fans as El Duce, even submitted to a lie detector test. Rich Lee.
I interviewed friends of Eldon Hoke's, El Duce, and I interviewed at length for about an hour Edward Gelb, the polygraph examiner. Gelb was extremely confident in his results, and everyone around El Duce, including his closest friends, said El Duce was an eccentric character on stage. Off stage, he was a very genuine person, and this is not something that he would lie about. And so, as odd as it seems, and even though I don't really believe that Courtney Love was trying to get punk rocker El Duce to actually do the deed, there probably is something to the idea that a friend of El Duce's was involved. I mean, I've spoken to that individual too, and as I recall, the gist of his responses was that he wasn't really ready to deny it. Now, whether that's because he's in punk rock or because he was involved, I really don't know.
In the British documentary Kurt and Courtney, produced by Nick Broomfield, Eldon Hoke clearly states he was offered $50,000 to shoot Cobain dead with a shotgun. He then expresses some regret he didn't take Love up on her offer. He then appears to let slip the name of the person who actually was involved. And that slip of the tongue may have cost Hoke dearly. Rich Lee.
If you look at that Nick Broomfield film, it does appear that El Duce, Eldon Hoke, was killed because he said to Broomfield, talk to my friend Alan about that. And Alan is Alan Wrench. And, you know, it's very plausible. Alan Wrench showed up like some gangster in an old movie and told El Duce, we're going to go for a ride.
On April the 19th, 1997, one day after one of his performances and 2 days after the filming of that Kurt Cobain documentary, Kurt and Courtney, he was found dead in railroad tracks in Riverside, California.
I've been to the train crossing. Believe me, you would not stumble across those tracks by accident. There are lots of lights and bells and everything. When the Burlington Northern goes by, you could be stone drunk and you would certainly still notice it. So I believe that Eldon Hoke was murdered, obviously.
When the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone continues, is the key to understanding Cobain's death to be found in his will?
And out. And in. Welcome back to the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. While you were away, we were working on our breathing exercises. I'll direct your breathing awareness to different stages of the podcast, and we want to focus all of your attention on each stage that I mention. Like this stage, the next stage of the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. There we go.
Welcome back to the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. Here's Richard Serrett.
On this episode of the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, it's part 2 of our 2-part series, Smells Like Murder, The Death of Kurt Cobain. It's important to repeat that none of these allegations have been proven in a court of law. Courtney Love is not a suspect in Kurt Cobain's death, and she has repeatedly and vigorously denied any involvement in his death. In his book, Love and Death, Max Wallace lays out the case that any possible motive revolves around Kurt's estate, a point that Love and Cobain's attorney, Rosemary Carroll, addressed in a taped conversation with Tom Grant. That's the man Love hired to find Kurt after he disappeared from rehab shortly before his death. Max Wallace.
Rosemary Carroll tells Tom Grant on tape that Kurt and Courtney were in the process of getting divorced, that he had approached her about changing the will. She had actually changed the will, but it hadn't yet been signed, so it wasn't legal. So we have motive. We have Courtney and Kurt had a prenuptial agreement. If they'd been divorced, Courtney would have got virtually nothing. She would have just got a very tiny settlement. So he dies before the will is changed and before the divorce goes through. And as a result, Courtney inherits an estate, or half an estate, worth, it's impossible to even speculate, it's probably more than $1 billion in future royalties. So there's a motive that others have cited.
He died intestate, technically. And, you know, of course, the astonishing thing about that is Kurt Cobain died with assets of $550,000, according to the court records. But everyone knew that his income would grow exponentially over time. Now he's worth about $500 million, his artistic output, which is 1,000 times higher than the amount that was dealt with in terms of the settlement of the will. Because he died intestate, there was no will. Strangely enough, when this movie Montage of Hex came out, they came up with a handwritten will. It even mentions Rosemary Carroll, as I recall. So the will is a very weird area to get into because, I mean, I believe they only published part of the page in a book that was put out as a part of Montage of Heck, which of course is controlled by Courtney Love. But Courtney Love was very influential in the making of that documentary, and somehow she came up with a Kurt Cobain handwritten will. Golly, where did that come from?
However, as the wife of Kurt Cobain and the mother of their child, Frances Bean, Washington estate law would normally override any will. Love would have been entitled to a sizable portion of Cobain's estate, and thus, that would tend to rule out a possible motive for murder. Not so fast, says Max Wallace.
Normally that's the case, but according to Washington's estate lawyers, that becomes voided because of their prenuptial agreement. So that's the case for a normal couple who are going through a divorce. But they had a prenuptial agreement, which was actually initiated at Courtney's request. Courtney always believed and always said that she would be more successful than her husband. So she insisted on a prenuptial agreement. And that prenuptial agreement, which was in full force and effect at the time, would have left her with a small settlement. Some people say it would have left her with nothing, but that's not true. It would have left her with a small settlement, and yet he died before the divorce went through, and as a result, she's a billionaire.
If Kurt Cobain had really written a will, there's no evidence that he did, at least not one that's technically legally valid. If he had written a will and said, Courtney Love gets nothing, the daughter gets 100%, which I believe is exactly the kind of thing that he should have incorporated into his prenuptial agreement. Everybody knew they had a prenuptial agreement. How do you have a prenuptial agreement that doesn't have a clause that says, in the event of my death? Well, if that prenup was written by Rosemary Carroll, maybe that's the explanation. Any competent lawyer in 1992 who was writing a prenuptial would not avoid the issue of in the event of my death. And, if his or her client was a rock star living a rather dangerous lifestyle, the clause dealing with in the event of my death should have been the number one concern, not divorce.
While hardly evidence implicating Courtney in murder, investigators have wondered aloud about her seemingly desperate attempts at gaining fame and wealth. But one could just as easily argue that Courtney Love likely would have achieved those things without marrying the voice of a generation. Her band Hole, formed by singer and guitarist Courtney Love and lead guitarist Eric Erlandson in Los Angeles in 1989, was already garnering strong interest from British and American alternative press long before she married Kurt. The band's debut album, Pretty on the Inside, released in 1991, was a critical success, and their second album, Live Through This, released in 1994, reached platinum status within a year of its release. Hole has been noted for being one of the most commercially successful female-fronted rock bands of all time, selling over 3 million records in the United States alone. So, in other words, don't read too much into Love's behavior either before or after Cobain's death. Eric Alper.
There's absolutely no doubt that people that knew Courtney Love thought that she was just destined for celebritydom and greatness and popularity. That was all the way back in high school. And there's been many people, including Michael Stipe from R.E.M., who is good friends with Kurt and Courtney, that said that she wanted to be famous by not necessarily any means necessary, but that was her plan. Courtney had written in her own diary rules and ways and the steps that she could be famous. She hung out with celebrities. She desperately wanted to be an actress, like some people do. And after Kurt Cobain's passing, certainly she had that time of mourning, and then she knew that she just had to live her life, that perhaps, Nirvana's royalties would only go so far, that most of the money would be not necessarily going to her, but put in trust for Francis, and her behavior was simply playing the media for all it's worth. It was almost like she had a mindset of, if you want the most dangerous, reckless, crazy, creative person in America, I'm your gal. And there's nothing wrong with that, because I think that we see that a lot with people who thrive on attention. But that was almost her intent before she had met Kurt. And in fact, before, when she had relationships with other rock stars like Billy Corgan, for instance, the minute that she set her eyes on Kurt Cobain, she was in love.
One of the main things that I directed people to is the film Black Widow, which Teresa Russell is a very sinister person. She's actually in Seattle for some of her murders. And one of the ways that she kills her husband, as portrayed by Dennis Hopper, is hypodermic through the cork of a champagne bottle. Courtney Love has a fascination with Black Widows. She sings Black Widow over and over again. She sings that Fleetwood Mac song, Gold Dust Woman. And at the end of Gold Dust Woman, right here in Seattle, walking distance from where her husband was murdered, Courtney Love gives concerts, at the Moore Theater, and bellows out, Black Widow, Black Widow. How could anyone possibly be more offensive than that?
One of the frustrating aspects of this case for people like Tom Grant and other investigators, such as Wallace and Lee, who argue Cobain was murdered, is that there was a rush to judgment on the part of the Seattle Police Department and the coroner. They saw the note, they saw the shotgun, and they declared it an open and shut case of suicide. All claims to the contrary were dismissed as mere conspiracy theory. But then, investigators who argue murder received some vindication from an unlikely source. Max Wallace.
Then, just 2 years ago, the Seattle police chief at the time, Norm Stamper, came out and admitted that they had rushed to judgment, and he calls on the authorities to reopen the investigation. That's all that myself and my partner are calling for in our book. We don't jump to any conclusions. We don't accuse anybody of murder. We just call for a fair and thorough investigation. And now we have the former Seattle police chief to back it up.
I love conspiracy theories. I don't know how much I believe in them, but I love the fact that they exist. And the reason why is because for all that I think I know is true, I have no idea if I even know what's true, because it's filtered down through the media, who is biased one way or the other. And, when you have the government or when you have the police for, decades and decades, we all kind of know that, yeah, you can pretty much trust them, but who knows?
I've been through the conspiracy theorist thing quite a lot. In fact, the judges, these 3 liberal judges, started off by saying Richard Lee is a local conspiracy theorist. This is their decision. This is a legal opinion. And I introduced myself by saying, I'm Richard Lee. I'm a journalist in his 5th decade of practice. I've surpassed 40 years. I'm now in my 5th decade. And then when they come back, this is an oral argument. They could not have missed it unless they were all sound asleep. And then they come back with their written decision, and it says, Richard Lee is a local conspiracy theorist. So let me make it clear, I don't really even believe that there needs to be a conspiracy in order for these things to happen. It's simply a confluence of interest. The local politicians and the local media, they don't get on the phone to Universal Studios or Geffen Records and ask what to do. It's just that we live in a very class-biased culture right now in the United States, and the people who are on the make and are making big money, whether they're politicians or entertainment executives or grunge musicians or the cop on the beat, who in Seattle is paid quite a lot of money, frankly, they all have the same interests. Their interests are a sort of dead-eye conservatism that says there are certain people who are respectable and decent, and they carry guns, and so many of them use guns in their professions. And then there are the dirty, disgusting poets and hippies. And you don't need to explain to a cop or a politician or an entertainment executive, who the privileged and powerful people are, and who, an entertainer is, who is sticking up for the working class. They know who should be on the receiving end of disadvantage. And, I believe it was George Bernard Shaw who said, assassination is the ultimate form of censorship. Having looked at this for the last 24 years, I would say, yeah, definitely this fits that mold. It doesn't mean that people are getting on the phone and saying, let's kill Kurt Cobain. It's just they let things happen. And, with someone like Courtney Love involved, it's basically the lamb laying down with the lion and the lamb becoming the lion's breakfast.
Was Kurt Cobain murdered, and was it made to look like a suicide? Is the narrative of Cobain as manic depressive and hopeless heroin addict a carefully constructed myth? Did the Seattle Police Department rush to judgment? Was the suicide note a forgery? Is Courtney Love a black widow? Or are all all of the points raised by investigators like Max Wallace, Rich Lee, and others just baseless allegations, mere idle speculation, wild assumption? Is this all just one crazy conspiracy theory? When does a conspiracy theory become a crime? Maybe the term conspiracy theory is just a clever conspiracy to pull the world over our eyes. As William Shakespeare himself wrote, "While you here do snoring lie, open-eyed conspiracy his time doth take. If of life you keep a care, shake off slumber and beware. Awake, awake." Until next time, I'm Richard Serrett. So long for now.
In their infinite wisdom, the pod gods have decided